Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 41, Official Negotiations. Naruto had only been to Mizu no Kuni a few times before, and never in a friendly way. It was similarly difficult putting together a retinue familiar with their eastern cousins. A Byakugan user was a must. Konoha had learned not to fight Kiri in their own mists without some kind of long-range detector. Naruto was a decent sensor, but he was no natural. Having Byakuya Hyuga along allowed him to focus on other matters, such as what he was going to say to the Mizukage. He remembered their last conversation at the Takichunin exams and the way she so naturally seemed to fit in that chair. She was confident, cunning, and wasn't above a bit of light manipulation. But, back then he wasn't a Kage. They should be on equal footing now in that regard. Although whether or not she would see it that way remained to be seen. He was the younger Kage, in both age and tenure, but the latter was only by a few months. She may have lived through and won a civil war, but Naruto wasn't bereft of experience either, and he had one of the wisest advisors you could ask for in Hiruzen, even if the older man wasn't with him now. Already the power games were in full effect as Naruto and his party were forced to wait at the very outskirts of the village, to be escorted in. He knew the Kirinin were aware of his presence. Byakuya had confirmed they were being watched towards the edge of his Jujutsu's range. They stayed there, in the damp of the waterlogged forest, for about 20 minutes before a small entourage of Kiri-junin arrived to escort them forward. Enough to try their patience, but not enough to convey offense. Nearly textbook, Hiruzen would have likely thought of several ways to turn this on its head by now. But Naruto wasn't Hiruzen. He was more than willing to wait out these little games. He was the visitor here, so already he was in the weaker negotiating position. Whatever Mei had to do to reinforce her confidence was fine with him. His main advantage was that she had no idea why he was here, and the fact that she had been perhaps a little too hasty in accepting his offer of talks. That eagerness was telling. Kirigakure was a beautiful village. What it lacked in Konoha's bustling rustic charm, it made up for in elegant, twisting architecture done in a white, almost metallic stone that shone with the condensation clinging to the walls. It also seemed more planned than Konoha's sometimes random street designs, more like an extended military base instead of the almost organic growth his own village had underwent. Although on that point he figured that Hiruzen might have been a bit too secure in the idea that other villages couldn't cotton on to Konoha's success. The signs of the recent civil war were still evident around him, in the hastily patched-up buildings and the more recent additions that didn't quite match the traditional aesthetic. The village was beginning to show some of that patchwork beauty that would have been so intensely familiar to any Leafnin. Likewise, he could see the bustle of activity, from both shinobi and civilians alike intermingling. Mei Terumi wasn't the proud type then, above learning from her rivals. That was useful to know. The Mizukage building was impressive in its own right, as scorched as it was by, if the bingo books were accurate about Terumi's abilities, lava. It might have passed for some kind of arena from the outside, if not for the many aqueducts sprouting off its circular form and spreading out through the village like a system of stony veins. The waterways were also apparently used as some kind of converted highway system, as he and his retinue were led right up one, using paths built on either side of the water flow, and straight into the heart of the building. Based on the aesthetic of the village, he might have expected a very Spartan, barestone sort of effect inside. Instead, everything was rather lavishly decorated with pastel colors, warm tapestries, and rich imported woods that banished any thoughts of the dreary weather outside. Even if the Yondaime Mizukage was a genocidal madman who threw his entire country into the bloodiest period in shinobi history since the clan wars, he had wonderful taste in decoration. This time, the Mizukage eschewed any more mind games and had him come right in, minus his entourage. That was fine though. They had their own orders, and it wasn't as though even with his retinue around they stood a much better chance of surviving aggressive action. The large window that dominated one side of the office was done in such a way that it cast the light streaming through the mist outside into entrancing rainbow patterns that danced across the walls distractingly. Sitting there in her plush, high-backed chair with all the elegance of a true leader, Mei Terumi managed to look even more beautiful than he remembered. Although that may have been the few extra inches of skin on display, this was a woman who played for keeps. "Why Hokage Dano?" she started, somehow making those first few words drip with a primal magnetism. "I must admit that it was an unexpected pleasure to hear you would come calling." Naruto pulled together all of his training to keep a comfortable but non-deferential smile on his face as he settled into the decidedly less comfortable chair opposite her desk. "The two of us partaking in such a private sojourn together, the other Kage must be scandalous. Should they be Mizukage Dano?" Naruto shot back easily, silently reminding himself over and over that he was the Hokage. After all, these are just friendly talks, are they not? Mei somehow turned the slight quirk of a lip into a sultry expression Anko would have killed to mimic. "Oh, of course." She leaned forward slightly, accentuating the depth of her neckline. "But you see, it's all about appearances with them, they likely balk at the idea of—" She drew herself in slightly, as if remiss to even speak it out loud, "what we might do together." Naruto leaned forward as well, humoring her. "Such as?" At that the auburn-haired woman leaned back with practiced nonchalance. "Oh, you know, trade monopolies, armament pacts, truces." She dropped her eyelids a fraction of an inch. "Alliances." Again, Naruto humored the idea, waving his hand as if weighing some invisible scale. "Well, such a block would be fearsome, they would have every right to be worried." He let that thought hover for a moment, before adding, "even if the idea is far-fetched." The Mizukage's smile didn't waver. "Of course." They continued in this manner for a good few minutes, lightly trading veiled barbs and tacit agreements. All of the actual negotiating was in the realm of the implied, nothing said outright, as was only proper for the leaders of ninja. But those agreements were no less ironclad and enforceable as the most legalese-infused concords between daimyo. It was all fairly simple stuff to begin with, the usual trade agreements and non-operation pacts that were always ignored with the implicit understanding that the other side would ignore them too. The dialogue only took a turn when Naruto lightly slipped in the subject of former Mizukage and his prior status. "Even you must admit that Kirigakure, despite their many accomplishments and well-deserved fame, are not well known for their fuinjutsu. Save, of course, what they plundered from Uzushiagakure alongside Kumo and Iwa. But that was a different generation and Naruto held no grudge for the woman in front of him. Or perhaps, Hokage Dano, you raise the bar too high on yourself. Your family's predilection for the art is well known. Kiri has managed just fine in the past with our Jinchuriki." On that, they both knew, she was lying through her teeth. Although they were very dignified, pearly teeth, and the lies slithered through as opposed to being forced. The Jinchuriki of the Rokubai had been AWOL for years now, even before the Civil War, and Naruto had a stack of damage reports on his desk back home attesting to the freedom of the Sanbai. Mei seemed to catch on to this when Naruto made no move to push the subject. "The Biju have always been a delicate subject around here, especially given the status of our former leader. The may he rot in hell went unsaid in this case. I can assure you that stringent efforts are being made to keep the situation domestic." Naruto just smiled. "I thought, in that regard, Konoha might be able to lend some aid." "For a hefty concession, I must imagine," Mei returned without missing a beat. The redhead just waved a hand airily. "The Biju are every nation's concerns, the damage they can wreak, even accidentally, is monstrous." There was something powerful in what went unspoken, the thought that Konoha might be willing to do an actual favor for another nation. Not the typical you owe me favor either. "We would certainly consider such aid," Mei said after a lengthy pause, the biggest concession she had made to letting something genuine slip through her tightly controlled facade. "As for now, I would be thrilled if you accepted Kirigakure's hospitality for the evening. I would personally recommend the sushi bar on the main street, perhaps we might even share a bite together sometime." Naruto knew it was still part of the game, that it wasn't really him and Mei speaking, but the Hokage and the Mizukage. How could I refuse? The subtleties only ended when they both stood, somehow leaving their personas in their chairs as they shared their first genuine appraisal of one another in those terse few moments. Finally, Mei cracked a smile, more genuine and 10 times more radiant than anything the Mizukage could manage. "I must say, you have played havoc with my expectations of you. The redhead nodded at the implied request. I feel we've said enough to call me Naruto. Naruto? She seemed to taste the word for the first time, apparently enjoying it by the smirk on her lips. Then I would be remiss if I didn't offer the same courtesy. The offer seemed a whole lot less layered than it did during the Chunin exams, and Naruto felt a lot more comfortable accepting. Then I can say the same for you, Mei. It was as though 100 unsaid things were passed between them in that moment, a mutual understanding, not so much between themselves as it was between leaders. We're both young leaders. Her eyes flickered to the corner of the room where Naruto knew had been hidden for the entirety of the negotiations, and we face mounting pressure on all sides. It is pleasant to know that there is a direction we might lean. Naruto didn't say anything, just extending his hand for a shake. The negotiations were far from over, but he felt the better part of the groundwork had been laid for something more solid. When she accepted his hand, a rare gesture in the world of shinobi when there was the implicit understanding that they could probably kill one another with less contact, he allowed a few teeth to show in his smile. The sushi, was it? Naruto found himself rather fond of the accommodation he and his party had been put up in. He could barely see the thick white stone the building was made of through the various plush furnishings that gave the hotel room a soft, comfortable atmosphere. He didn't dwell on it long though before doing the mandatory check for surveillance seals in any listeners in. He found a few, but that was to be expected as a foreign dignitary. They became redundant all the same when he placed down a pre-prepared seal that mimicked the one permanently set in the Hokage's office. A clever construction of the Ni-Dime, it didn't so much block sounds leaving the room, as it did distort them. Likewise, it made any images inside the confines of the room fuzzy, for lack of a better word. It was excellent for disguising hand signals for anybody who might be watching in. When he was sure he was secure for the moment, he tossed a Hiraishin kunai into the center of the room. A moment later, and with a yellow flash that was almost nostalgic, 4 people appeared in the room. 3 of them vanished almost as soon as they appeared, taking Byakuya with them and leaving a perfect doppelganger in his place. Komaki had been chosen to be dropped off by the Yondaime's old bodyguard because of her rather excellent henge, one of the best in Umbu. Rather nice place, isn't it? Naruto asked, just in case Kiri had some other method of listening in. The real conversation was happening in subtle hand signals. Status report. Doesn't quite compare to home, they can only hope to emulate the quiet dignity of the Hyuga compound. Target moving up the coast, ETA 7 minutes. Yes, well, I imagine that familiarity would have the residents here say otherwise. Good, rendezvous with surveillance team and await further instruction. Komaki sniffed haughtily, and if Naruto didn't know any better, he would have said she was enjoying the ruse. They can believe what they like, I suppose. Just because they've finally wrapped up that barbaric civil war, doesn't mean they can start pretending otherwise. Orders understood. Additional note, possible code sunrise. Naruto had to quickly suppress a frown. Akatsuki could be trouble. By all their intelligence, it was too early for them to be making a move. Had something changed? We're the guests here, and I have to admit, the place has its own charm. Continue as normal, do not engage, dismissed. Komaki sniffed again, imitating the typical Hyuga pride with practiced ease. Before she could even lower her nose, she was gone and replaced again by the real Byakuya. You should see to your own room, Byakuya. I intend to sample Kiri's hospitality for at least the night. The real Hyuga nodded imperceptibly, acknowledging the true order to scout the area as much as possible. Of course, Hokage-sama. Alone again, Naruto walked over to a nearby window, hiding his thoughts behind a veneer of curiosity at the mist-swept panorama that sprawled out beneath him. It was a wonderful view, but the young Hokage had little time to appreciate it as he considered the new information. The fact that the Akatsuki might interfere was concerning. Naruto wasn't afraid of them, especially since dealing with Kisame, but in that instance he could count on Itachi staying out of the fight. 2's class missing Nin would be a tougher pill to swallow, especially if it was the pair who had tried to kidnap Fu. Still, if things went according to plan. He was only made to wait 10 minutes before there was a knock at the door. He wasn't surprised. He had thought they would send somebody to check up on him after whatever surveillance system they had failed. What was surprising, was finding the Mizukage herself outside his door, looking a great deal less official without her wide-brimmed hat. "How are you finding the accommodation?" It wasn't hard to switch out the surprise on his face with bemusement. The small breach in protocol was promising. Pleasant, if missing the comforts of home. May somehow made her amusement as sultry as if she had simply walked into the room already shedding her clothes. "Oh, I can imagine, from what I've heard you're quite the family man." Technically news of Anko's pregnancy wasn't supposed to leave the village, but it would be naive to expect the other Kage not to know something like that. The fact that May chose to bring it up though, it was acknowledging that aspect of their game was shelved. "I was particularly interested in the seals on the windows, I assumed to keep them water repellent." He wasn't. He knew they were likely spoils from the fall of Uzushiagakur, but he was keen to switch topics. "Shouldn't I be the one asking you? One of the youngest seal masters in history is certainly one of your more impressive titles." The redhead's lips quirked. Seals? Seals were comfortable. Seals he could talk about for hours. The funny thing about Fuinjutsu is that no matter how much you think you know, there's always more. Not unlike any field of study then. May added, pouring herself a drink from the decanter that had been left in the room. Naruto had yet to touch it, probably wouldn't have if she wasn't demonstrating its safety, another calculated show of trust. The woman was clearly working towards something. Unfortunately, Fuinjutsu has always been a limited aspect of Kiri's past, in favor of more martial pursuits. And the difficulty of the last few years has only worsened the situation. So that was how she was choosing to phrase the civil war, a difficulty. In other words, tacitly stating their weakness without suggesting the village had lost its bite. "I'm sure what we may call seal masters would barely register as dabblers in the art to somebody like you." He could tell she was skirting around the subject and decided to push it a little. "A metaphorical deficit in supply then." That seemed to stall the older woman for a moment, but she caught herself brilliantly, giving a non-committal wave. "Perhaps more of an overdemand, for the moment." "Well then, I would be a poor leader if I didn't point out that Konoha might be in a position to weigh in on the matter." "Oh, they would then? How very forward." May pushed her chest out slightly, but it was mostly empty play. She had clearly given up on trying to use that approach in her negotiations. "And what would be your counter-offer in this metaphorical matter?" "Well, on something as nebulous as Fuinjutsu that could vary a great deal, but that's what negotiations are for. Unless the matter was time-sensitive." He could almost see the woman's eyes harden slightly, some of the pretense slipping away as he made his position as clear as could be in the silky trappings of shinobi talk. "If you choose to go this way, a high price will be exacted." May moved back, gliding across the room to lean against a nearby armrest. She made a show of examining the room as she considered it. Naruto chose that moment to drop in the caveat. "Of course, Konoha has always been kind to her allies, the leaf is eager to forge closer ties with those she calls friend." His meaning was once again crystal clear. "There might be a steep price, but you need friends, and Konoha is the best you could make." He could see the gears grinding away behind those pale green eyes. He couldn't predict the outcome as he still hadn't made a proper read on the wily Mizukage. He could however, bank on what he did know. Kirigakure was recovering, and by the looks of it undergoing extensive remodeling in the wake of their recent difficulty. It also looked as though May had chosen Konoha as the image to rebuild her village in. If the ideology ran stronger than a simple strategic move, there was something to work with there. Eventually he could see she had come to a decision. "Would you care to take a walk with me, Naruto?" Naruto recognized that look all too well, and for the first time realized that he wasn't the only leader who agonized over their decisions, even after they were made. "It depends if we're walking towards a certain biju." If May was surprised by the bluntness of his question, she didn't let it slip, apparently resigning herself to her choice as she set her shoulders and gave a coy smile. "Must you ruin the surprise?" The efficiency with which the small coastal village had been evacuated was commendable. Clearly it wasn't just the shinobi of Mizu no Kuni that had gotten good at dealing with sudden attacks during the Civil War. It was a good thing too, even from the steep rise a few hundred meters from the village wall Naruto could see the damage was extensive. Most of the buildings and structures near the water were little better than kindling, the rest had been compromised by the flood waters reducing the soil to a soupy muck. What dominated the vista though, was the enormous creature thrashing wildly just off the shore. Currently it was being harried by a group of Kirinin, if harried was even the right word. Mildly irritated might have done the scene better justice, as water jutsu that would have easily drilled through solid rock splashed harmlessly against the sandbai's enormous shell. Simply turning in place caused great swells of water that threatened to level the rest of the increasingly sorry-looking village. Quite a sight, Naruto muttered, already repressing images of a different night 15 years ago. The sandbai couldn't compare to the sheer malice or suffocating power of the Kyubey, but it was still a biju. One I'd hoped never to witness again if I'm allowed a rare moment of honesty, Mei admitted, reminding Naruto that she had been the one to take down Yagura and had likely faced this beast before. His respect of her abilities as a kunoichi rose a few notches. Any advice before we start? Mei just motioned to the ongoing fight that was happening below, pointing out a Kiryumbu that had been slapped aside by one of the beast's great scaled tails and sent skidding across the water like some overlarge skipping stone. Mind the tails. Naruto allowed him one last grin at the flippancy she could manage in the face of such overwhelming power before setting his face into what Ami had taken to calling Hokage mode. He threw a Hiraishin kunai into the dirt at his feet, and in 3 quick flashes a small team of Umbu had been dropped off in front of them. His father had been onto something when he granted a select few people the ability to perform the Hiraishin as a group. He would have to think on refining the process later, for now. Taka, north. Buta, east. Saru, west. Inu, south. He handed them each a large scroll twice the size of the normal sealing variety. Set up and begin connecting, don't attempt to complete the seal until I've set the foci. When he received 4 professional nods he waved them off, quickly pulsing his chakra to signal another drop-off. Instantly, Tenzo was in front of him and Naruto could practically feel the grimace beneath the man's mask. You know what to do, herd, don't restrain. Asking the fledgling Mokuton user to restrain the 3 tails would have been a bit much, but the man could certainly keep it in place long enough for the others to get in position. He seemed to shore himself up a bit before nodding and flickering off to join the others. Naruto glanced across at Mei only to find the woman staring at him with a calculating gaze. It's almost as though you had planned for this, Hokage Dano. The redhead shrugged, his mind was already half taken up by the various on-the-fly calculations he was making. It pays to be prepared in our profession, and as I said, the Biju are every nation's concern. Mei simply hummed, glancing back down to where the Konoha Umbu were beginning to take up their positions amongst their mist counterparts. I will inform my shinobi not to interfere and protect your men if possible. You understand if I won't have them throw away their lives though. I wouldn't ask the same, Naruto acknowledged, running through a few lightning-quick hand seals. A moment later an enormous scroll, perhaps a little smaller than a summoning contract, appeared in his hands. He slung it over his back, it was the keystone of this entire operation, and carefully measured his shot before throwing a single kunai as hard as he could towards the beast. Dropping his mask for a single instant, long enough to wink at the Mizukage, he said, "See you on the other side," before vanishing in a flash of red. What a curious man, Mei mused before dashing off at her own pace. Her Umbu would need all the help they could get keeping the sandbai in one position. She knew from experience. Komaka cursed her luck as she faced down the fury-filled glare of the sandbai. The enormous beast seemed to have taken a rather personal interest in crushing her flat as it once again flailed its tails. It didn't help that every turn of its body caused the water to roil and bubble as waves bigger than she was attempted to fling her back onto land. All of this might have been manageable if it didn't also feel like her lungs had been filled with boiling lead and her arms weighed down by anchors. The Biju's presence was just oppressive, no easier way to say it. Its hatred was like a physical waves that radiated out and rolled over her in thick, hot pulses that threatened to have her legs turn and run with no input from her brain. All of this, and she had to focus on the complicated seal floating on the water in front of her, because if she didn't all of this would have been for nothing. Her only solace was that the other 3 Umbu across the cardinal directions were also feeling this and they hadn't wavered either. She caught a red flash appearing way up on the sandbai's shell and felt a little of that smothering malice lift as the Biju refocused on the new nuisance riding it like the world's largest rodeo. Komaka could almost smile behind her mask as she saw her Hokage give her a cheeky wave from atop the beast before hastily rolling to the side to avoid one of its great Chidi news tails. She knew he would be busy for the next few moments placing the anchor seals that would ensure all of this worked. How he could stand to be that close to the beast was beyond her. The fact it looked as though he was having a great time ducking and weaving across its shell was mind-boggling. Kage were crazy, the lot of them. And as if to prove her right, the Mizukage suddenly slammed into the side of the beast like a meteor, shrouded in a pale mist that caused the Biju to give a deafening shriek of pain and anger. The Umbu, Kiri, and Konoha alike, could only watch in wonder as the mist visibly ate into the shell that their most powerful jutsu could barely scratch. Not to be outdone in ever the competitive spirit, Naruto chose the moment when the Sanbai focused all of its attention on Mei and made it regret it. He suddenly appeared before the creature's face holding a Rasengan bigger than its eye before flashing away, there for less time than it took to blink. The moment the jutsu was bereft of its creator, it expanded rapidly, engulfing the beast's head in a shrieking, grinding sphere of chaotic energy that saw its bulky tails fall limp behind it, stunned. Naruto chose that moment to appear beside her, nearly causing her to lose focus. She should have gotten used to such displays back in Umbu, but it was easier said than done. The anchors are set, get ready to begin the sealing, he said, face stony but with the spark of adrenaline alight behind his eyes. I think the Mizukage will help me keep it distracted, but I'm not counting on it. I'm going to relay the others to start closing the trap, so things are about to get rough, bullet and dash. She never got to hear what he would say next as he suddenly threw himself in front of her, taking the brunt of an explosion that appeared out of nowhere. When the tinny whine in her ears finally subsided, the Umbu masks helped in that regard, it was replaced by the beating of enormous wings. Don't get what all the fuss is about, he wasn't that tough. You sure that was the same guy who took out Kisame? She peered up through the clearing smoke at the two silhouettes bickering atop an enormous white bird, one tall and lanky, the other squat and hunched over, both wearing the recognizable red clouds of the Akatsuki. Don't be so complacent, he may have been young but he is a Hokage nonetheless. Your worthless art won't have taken him out of the fight so easily and we still have a job to do here. Komaka tried not to panic. The Umbu had been briefed about the Akatsuki and their known or suspected members. Yeah, time is money and all that, it's a good thing my art works just as well in a flash. Then again, she never thought she might be facing any of them, especially ones that could catch Naruto off guard. That's Kakuzu, you fool, I simply don't wish to keep Leader-sama waiting. So hurry up and deal with the trash while I see to the beast. The Umbu took a calming breath, resigning herself to what would likely be a last stand, making sure the sealing went uninterrupted. She let it out as a sigh of relief when somebody else stepped up in front of her. I'm afraid you have more pressing concerns, Akasuna no Sasori, Mei stated calmly, her voice carrying above the violent waves and the pained roars of the Sanbai, and the woman turned slowly to the lanky blonde, whoever you are. Komaka wondered if it was a trait all Kage shared to make their subordinates feel just as safe and secure as if they were back home in a training field. She almost wanted to grin at the irritated expression the other S-class Nukenin wore as he stomped his foot angrily atop the strange, lumpy bird. It's Datara, yeah? Learn it, you sorry excuse for a Mizukage. I want to introduce this one to my art, Sasori Dana. The hunched-over missing nin grunted irritably, saying, you have your orders, go. I'll deal with the woman. Before hopping down off the bird to stand across from the Mizukage on the turbulent waters. Datara clearly looked pained for a moment before scowling and directing the bird to fly off in the direction of the other Umbu. Komaka wondered what she was supposed to do. She was right next to a potential fight between S ranks, her teammates were in trouble from another and they were all still in the middle of a Biju ceiling. And where the hell was Naruto? Chapter 42, Official Combat. Naruto woke to a small stream of bubbles gently filtering past his face. It only took him a moment to realize he was underwater before he quickly oriented himself and kicked out with his legs to reach the surface. It was times like these he wished he could figure out how to make the hydration work underwater. He surfaced easily and dragged himself up on top of the water with a slight grumble of annoyance. He hated being wet, it weighed him down and made his hair cling to his face. From there it only took him a second to regain his bearings and take stock of the situation. The Sanbai was exactly where he remembered it being, still enclosed by the incomplete web of the sealing matrix. That meant his Umbu weren't dead, good. Mei was exchanging pre-fight banter with an Akatsuki member, the cloak was a bit of a giveaway. That was fine, the Mizukage could handle herself, so there was no need for the damsel in distress antics. The problem was that Akatsuki always worked in Pa. Yep, there was the other one. He almost missed him thanks to the glare of the sun masking his silhouette. The long blonde hair was notable, but a quick flick through his internal bingo book couldn't put a face to a name. He was likely a recent Nukenin then. The other option was that he was too weak to have been memorable, and that seemed unlikely when he was wearing those red clouds. A quick survey of the potential battlefield had Naruto feeling uneasy. This guy either had a summons that let him fly, or a technique that did the same. They were quite far off the coast by now, as had been the plan to slowly lure the sandby that way to prevent further destruction. It wasn't like he could place hydration seals on water, although that was something to think about for the future, as his kunai would be next to useless at the bottom of the sea. That left the Biju itself as the only reliable source of stable terrain. Not exactly a comforting thought. He cracked his neck and stood a little straighter, all of these thoughts having passed through his head in a few seconds. The beginnings of the idea that he might have become just a little too reliant on his father's technique crept into the back of his mind before it was trampled down by more pressing concerns. He felt for the kunai still embedded in the sandby's shell and flashed there, ignoring the shuddering growls of the creature still recovering from his previous attack. He glanced up in time to spot the Akatsuki member suddenly take a dive towards the dog-masked Umbu holding the north position. Instinctively the redhead reached for his tanto only for his hand to close on thin air. With a curse, he realized he must have been separated from it by the explosion. The hard way it was. With aim born through years of rigorous training and refined by two Uchiha teammates, he managed to catch the strange white bird right in the underbelly with a kunai. When he appeared in the air next to it, his arm flicked out like a whip to grab a handful of clay. He had been expecting feathers, or maybe skin. The soft, yielding material that he gripped was disconcerting, almost like it would come apart in his hands. He grabbed the kunai instead, nearly pulling it out of the thing by accident. Sasori Dana was right, you are made of sterner stuff than I thought. The blond man was peering over the edge of the bird thing's wing at him, a bemused grin warping his features. That's good to know. Means I can test some of my stronger art, yeah. The man then did one of the most disgusting things Naruto had ever seen, which was saying a lot, by reaching into two pouches on his waist. When he withdrew them, it revealed a set of mouths embedded in each of his palms, audibly chewing with grotesque exaggeration. Feel honored, Hokage Dana, you're the first Kage ever to see my art firsthand. The mouths spat out their wads of clay, and with deft movements the man easily molded them into little white hummingbirds. It might have been impressive if the redhead hadn't already seen what those things could do. The name's Datara, by the way, you'll want to remember that, yeah? The blonde seemed to rethink his statement as the hummingbirds took to the air. For as long as you have left, anyway. The clay birds immediately zipped towards him with all the speed of their biological counterparts. Acting on instinct alone, Naruto let go of the larger bird. He grabbed his kunai and twisted his body around to send a slash of wind chakra at the first of the mobile bombs. He succeeded in cutting it in half, but that only caused it to explode prematurely. The shockwave battered his body midair, making him tumble in a less controlled fashion than he might have liked. He could still spot the other one buzzing towards him. He tried to cut it in half as well, but they were apparently smarter than that. It began jinking madly to avoid his repeated slashes. Testing just how smart they were, he threw his kunai downwards as hard as possible, and sure enough the hummingbird shot after it. That meant they were anticipating his technique instead of just homing in on him. They were either completely autonomous, which was worrying, or more likely, guided by Datara. Bucking expectation, he did in fact vanish in a flash of red, only to reappear atop the larger clay bird behind the man in question. He had made sure to place a marker on the thing when he was holding on before. Before the Akatsuki member could even widen his eyes in surprise, a tri-pronged kunai was embedded in his throat. Naruto might have been satisfied by this if the man's skin didn't start turning an alarming shade of white. He tried to pull his weapon back only to find it stuck. He abandoned it in favor of diving from the clay construct just as it exploded in a dizzyingly large blast that once again had him tumbling through the air in an uncontrolled spin. Right towards the sandby. He sighed internally, wondering how Mei was getting on. Far from the pitched, Frantic battle of the Hokage, Mei and Sasori had yet to move from where they had begun their exchange. The Mizukage may have been slightly disadvantaged, surrounded by water where her lava techniques were less than optimal, but far from defenseless. Even now the thin veil of her boil technique was evaporating, taking with it the melted, useless lumps that were once hundreds of poisoned kunai. The ones that had breached her acidic mist had been so thoroughly scoured that even if she hadn't moved to avoid them, they would have been no more lethal than their medicinal counterparts. An impressive technique for sure. I look forward to working out its intricacies when you lie still on my workshop table, Sasori mused in his gruff tones, shifting slightly beneath his cloak. Mei hummed thoughtfully. Akasuna no Sasori, yes, I'd heard of your grisly little technique with human puppets. Her smirk was devilish. A shame, I had always somewhat admired the Suna Puppet Corp, for their discipline if not their predilection for playing with dolls. The hunched man failed to rise to the bait, once again shifting beneath his cloak. It made it difficult to determine exactly what he was doing. Both glanced up briefly as a huge explosion tore through the sky, apparently enough of a distraction for Sasori to suddenly launch himself forward at surprising speeds. Mei wasn't one to be taken off guard so lightly though and easily flipped back, actually stepping off the thin silvery blur that whipped out of Sasoyer's cloak like some metallic snake. She landed elegantly on the water in a slight crouch, moving with all the fluidity of her country's namesake. Teal eyes peered out from a veil of auburn hair at the new weapon, eyeing it wearily. Some kind of prehensile blade that appeared more like the tail of a scorpion given what had been revealed when Sasori tore through his own cloak. Appropriate, in her mind, given his name. The tail was easily dismissed though, no more dangerous than any other weapon, even with the telltale purple sheen of the virulent poison Sasori favored. No, the disturbing revelations were the clearly segmented joints littering Sasori's body. Now, don't you know it's rude to keep secrets from a lady? She asked demurely, eyes glancing about to try and spot where Sasori might really be hiding. For a puppeteer of his fame, it could be damn near anywhere. The fact that they were this far off the coast narrowed it down somewhat, but even beneath the water was suspect. And it is ruder still to keep one waiting, so I will endeavor to make this quick so I can go mop up that useless new Hokage for my idiot of a partner. I would recommend not underestimating that one, I've already made the same mistake once. Sasori didn't deign to answer that time, which was good because Mei, despite appearances, wasn't the type to banter in a fight. Banter was a luxury of victory, the Civil War had taught that lesson to all of its survivors. She had already concluded that trying to locate a skilled puppeteer was a fool's errand, so settled with smashing all of his toys until he revealed himself. It was more in line with her skill set anyway. With a fingertip just beneath her lips she began spitting out large globules of molten lava like bullets. Each was hot enough to visibly warp the air around them, but not nearly fast enough to catch the puppet unawares. Sasori, or at least his puppet, was easily able to dodge to the side and allow the dangerous projectiles to harmlessly land in the water with hissing gusts. It was only when the steam failed to dissipate after a few volleys of the technique that Sasori caught on to what was going on. By then it was too late. Mei had expertly hidden her slow application of the hidden mist technique amidst the geysers of steam her lava created, quickly shrouding the immediate area in an impenetrable shroud of fog. She was far from a swordsman of the mist in her use of the silent killing techniques, but against an inanimate puppet? She didn't have to be all that quiet. Sasori cleared his surroundings with some kind of compressed air canister attached to one of his arms just in time for Mei to descend on him with a punishing axe kick that formed a crescent of lava behind it. The first hit was enough to crack the tough carapace of the puppet, the molten rock that followed finished the job. Mei jumped back to land on the water's surface even as the puppet began to bubble and hiss, wood and metal alike buckling and scorched under the intense heat of the technique. She did not, however, miss the small form that darted out of the wreckage in time to avoid a similar fate. Sasori brushed a few smoldering embers from his shoulder with a surprisingly neutral expression. That was one of my best puppets. Mei defaulted to her usual smirk at the comment. I'm sorry, I didn't know it was your favorite toy. Sasori's lip didn't so much as twitch. You will have ample opportunity to replace him when all is said and done. 2 boys in a row? What kind of woman do you take me for, young man? She hid her astonishment at Sasori's appearance rather well. For a man supposedly in his late 40s, he had all the trappings of a teen younger than even Naruto. A bubbling sense of irritation rose in her stomach all the same. Some people could wish to age even half as well as that. Some people really did win the gene pool. It won't matter soon enough. The banter was somewhat interrupted by the deafening cry of the Sanbai somewhere off to one side before the world turned white. Naruto was getting sick of dodging. He may have been fast, agile and on most occasions highly maneuverable, but those traits leaned themselves towards sharp, aggressive fights. Protracted battles of attrition were not his cup of tea. He could certainly manage them, as the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi his chakra wasn't running out any time soon, but he didn't enjoy them. His fights were sprints, and right now this one was turning into a marathon. Even on the limited grounds of the Sanbai's shell, he was able to dodge Deidara's various explosive creations. However, the same thing that prevented the Akatsuki member from ensnaring the redhead, also prevented Naruto from catching him in return: distance. As long as Deidara rode around on his latest beast, a clay dragon of all things, he was nigh untouchable. Throwing Hiraishin kunai at him was an exercise in futility. The dragon simply coughed up smaller versions of itself that swooped in and ate the damn things. Clearly the blonde was trying to goad him into flashing to one anyway, likely to blow him up in the attempt, as the smaller dragons orbited him instead of homing in for the kill. Naruto had already demonstrated he could move fast enough to avoid them if they tried. So for now, the two of them were at somewhat of a deadlock. They might have stayed that way if it were just the two of them. Fortunately, or unfortunately dependent on perspective, there was a rather notable third player. The Sanbai bucked suddenly, lifting Naruto off his feet almost long enough for Deidara to actually catch him with one of his C2 sculptures. It smacked into an enormous scaled tail instead, reduced to putty in an instant and exploding without leaving so much as a scorch mark against the Bijuu's near impenetrable carapace. The blast, while ineffectual, was apparently irritating, and the response was the beast's tail suddenly arching up over its body like a scorpion's. Deidara nearly fell off his dragon when the first lance of pressure water cleaved the air next to his head. A few inches to the right and it would be missing entirely. He was forced to drop his creation into a steep dive as the tight beam of water tracked him, aiming to cut him in half. Naruto wasn't faring much better, forced to roll and weave even more madly as two different streams tried to corral him into bifurcation. They didn't so much as dent the Sanbai's shell, but he didn't want to find out what they would do to human flesh. It was an untenable situation. The water didn't look like it was stopping anytime soon, and eventually Naruto was forced to dive right off the shell and into the surrounding water. It wasn't much better though, as he was immediately caught up in the undertow of the beast's enormous body. Before he could be sent tumbling deeper underwater, he used a simple water bullet jutsu to launch him in the opposite direction. He pulled himself back onto the surface nearby to one of his umbu, once again irritatingly wet. From there he had a wonderful view of the Sanbai turning its full attention on Deidara. He watched as the three deadly streams slowly converged on the man's position, despite his attempts to disrupt them with explosions of various size. Outside of the frantic melee, Naruto could appreciate the faint rainbow in the air caused by the showering mist of the streams bursting apart only to tighten again to continue bearing down on the blonde. The Akatsuki member appeared to be growing desperate, especially when the three separate streams converged into one enormous deluge that was likely to leave little of him left if it struck. Finally, he was forced to sacrifice his mount in a titanic explosion that disrupted the Sanbai's technique long enough for him to create a replica of his earlier clay bird, quickly climbing upwards and almost out of earshot. Almost. Naruto could still just about make out his near-hysterical screams directed at the glowering beast below. "Think you can finish me with such pathetic spirit, yeah? How about you chew on my latest creation?" Naruto felt a pit grow in his stomach following the announcement as an odd sort of pressure settled over the battlefield. The Sanbai had craned its neck up, its tails stretching almost improbably to point at its mouth where humming balls of pure chakra were beginning to congeal into a larger, darker sphere Naruto only knew of through second-hand accounts. "Umbu, brace yourselves." Naruto didn't know just how much of an understatement his declaration was as the hyperdense sphere of chakra was sent careening up through the air to meet the comparatively tiny sculpture Deidara had dropped. This moment would be the future reminder to the young Hokage not to estimate a jutsu's potency by its size. To describe the meeting of those two techniques as catastrophic wouldn't have done it justice. For a moment, The entire sky was wreathed in a halo of white and all sound seemed to have been sucked from creation. If Naruto hadn't forcibly pulled his eyes down at the last moment, he may have been seriously blinded. As it was, that likely stopped him from being so awed by the scale of the explosion that he forgot to move. He jumped in front of his Umbu just in time to pull up as large a water wall as he was able just as the first wave of superheated air rushed past them. Even with the chakra pumping through his technique, the wall of dense water was threatening to evaporate on the spot. The ocean beneath their feet recoiled sharply as a wave of pressure tried to crush everything beneath it into a crater, only to rush back in the opposite direction in time to meet the wall of pure noise. It took a few seconds for the world to settle itself. Mist rose in sheets as the superheated water was swept away by the pressure wave, replaced by cooler, deeper waters. All Naruto could hear was a tinny whine that he prayed wasn't permanent damage. For one, he'd never hear the end of it from Tsunade. A quick glance told him that, thankfully, the Kiryumbu's training had prevailed and they had the wherewithal to copy him, shielding his own subordinates from the worst of the blast. The Sanbai on the other hand wasn't so lucky. Its shell was visibly glowing from the heat and the fleshy parts of its body were smoking. Right now, it just floated lazily atop the water, unconscious, but Naruto wasn't sure how long that would last. He turned to his nearest Umbu to check on him, finding the man, miraculously, still holding onto the sealing technique. It looked almost ready. He tried to ask how the man was, but his voice sounded like it had been muffled by several layers of carpet. The Umbu tilted his head at him, so he signed the same message. He got a slightly shaky nod, but right now he would take that. He glanced back at the Biju. Now would be the best time to seal it, but he still didn't know where their errant Akatsuki bomber had ended up. Although, he found it unlikely the man had come out of that unscathed. Mei swiftly dispelled the sphere of water she had hidden within, moisture that might have clung to her clothes and hair included. The explosion had been tremendous, but it seemed all of her Umbu had reacted in time to save themselves and their Konoha counterparts. They had been trained in a crucible after all and knew very well how devastating a Bijudama could be. Although, this one seemed a tad more spectacular than usual. She put that up to the Hokage's opponent. And speaking of opponents, she eyed the faintly glowing orb of metal that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere to enshroud and protect Sasori. Near the bottom, where it touched the water, she could see it was composed of thousands of metal filings. The same could not be said for the top, that part was melted together into glowing red lump. A moment later it cracked off and sank into the water with a hiss, the still usable metal dust beneath buzzing agitatedly as it dispersed. This time Sasori didn't mask the displeasure in his voice, even if his features remained as neutral as ever. That fool, I warned him not to use anything so extravagant. While he was muttering to himself, Mei took the lull in combat to examine his latest puppet. She didn't recognize the face, but the technique was distinctive enough. I didn't realize I would have the pleasure of making the acquaintance of two foreign Kage when I woke up this morning, she called. I'm afraid he's long past the point of political banter, as am I, came the curt response. I'm continually having to clean up that idiot's messes and that's my time wasted. I can't stand having my time wasted. Mei's eyebrow quirked elegantly at the unwanted insight. Don't we all? She mused sardonically. She wasted no time in flashing through hand seals, once again bringing a hand up as though she were blowing smoke from her fingertips. A deep violet mist spread from her lips in a stream towards the puppeteer and his puppet, although Sasori seemed unconcerned. Your acidic mist is an interesting technique, I grant, but you'll find my puppets are well treated against such degradation. He raised a hand, hidden beneath his voluminous robe, and the third Kage lurched forward. A good chunk of the iron particles hanging in the air swarmed around it, forming two wicked blades extending from its forearms. Mei smirked in a manner that, to any Kiri shinobi, should have been warning enough. The funny thing about my skilled mist, is that everyone assumes it's simply acidic. She raised a hand and gently clicked her fingers, sending a single spark flickering through the air. The moment it touched the mist, the entire vicinity was engulfed in a roaring blaze that flared white for a few seconds before vanishing as fast as it appeared. There was a loud splash as the Kage puppet, unable to protect itself completely, fell uselessly into the water. Sasori had only survived because he had diverted the rest of the iron dust to act as a shield for himself. His cloak hadn't fared quite so well, falling apart in scorched tatters to reveal the monstrosity of his body beneath. May hid her revulsion expertly. I knew it wasn't possible to look so good at your age without having a bit of work done, but that seems a bit much. Sasori ignored the taunt, allowing the prehensile cable coiled in his abdomen unwind as the blade-like propellers on his back unfurled. When I kill you, and transform you into a puppet, you will be the same as me, free from the ravages of age, a perfect marriage of art and immortality. Though you certainly aren't as valuable as the ones you have destroyed, it is a start. I will take immense pleasure in it. During his little speech, he missed the increasingly dark look May was giving him as her face slowly lowered, hair falling forward to shadow her eyes. Ravaged by age, imperfect marriage, have no value, can't offer pleasure. I'm going to kill you, she whispered almost soft enough for Sasori to miss. He glanced back at her in confusion only to see her lunging towards him, breathing out a thick crescent of lava. His hand immediately came up, a small tube emerging from his palm. As if emulating the sandby, a stream of water burst out, immediately cooling the lava down into useless rocks that splashed into the water at his feet. He moved his hand in an almost lazy arc. The palm tube turned as the pressure of the water increased from a thick spray, to a stream thinner than a ryo coin that could cut through solid rock. It split the rushing Mizukage in half with almost negligible ease. Too much ease. Sasori turned, and if his eyes could still widen they would have as he found the cruel gaze of the Mizukage inches from his face. You're clearly inexperienced with women, otherwise you would know better. She leaned forward lightning quick and almost tenderly caught the puppeteer's wooden lips with her own. It soon became obvious that this was no ordinary kiss though as, one by one, glowing orange veins spread across the Akatsuki member's body. He tried to gut her with his poisoned cable, but she had already danced back, looking on with a quiet sort of satisfaction. He grasped his neck, body starting to fail him as more and more of his internal workings were rendered useless by the streams of lava coursing through his body. He was luckier than most. Had he still been flesh and blood the technique would have been excruciating. As it was, he only had to contend with the sense of panic as his body was melted away from the inside. In a last-ditch effort, the tiny part of him that was still organic detached from his torso, launching itself in the direction the Kazekage had sunk. It was a desperate attempt though, and May caught the pulsing little thing with a disgusted grimace, watching it writhe and paw at her with pathetically weak chakra strings. You should have learned to grow old with some dignity, she said, feeling little sympathy for the monster she held. A final breath of acidic mist put the Tsunanukenin out of his misery, and without much care she tossed the bubbling lump into the water. She took a single moment to commemorate an opponent that had put up a decent fight and, under different circumstances, may have seriously given her a run for her money, before turning her attention to more pressing matters. Such as where the young Hokage had gotten himself to. With no direct line of sight on the wayward bomber, Naruto did the next best thing and did the rounds with his umbu, keeping a wary eye on the unconscious Sanbai all the while. He also made sure to thank the Kiri shinobi he came across, which apparently was both unprecedented and surprising to them. However, these men and women had put their lives on the line to protect his subordinates. He wasn't going to let something like national borders hold back his gratitude. May and Sasori's battle had moved away before the blast, so by the time he reached Komaki she was alone again, still holding up the sealing matrix with the admirable perseverance that made Konoha such a menace on the battlefield. It was the moment he stepped away from her to more thoroughly search the area that he felt the first tingle of that oh-so-important sixth sense all surviving shinobi gained at some point or another. A sudden dive to the left saved his arm as a hummingbird burst out of the water below him and exploded without warning. It was not alone. He was swarmed in an instant, only his prodigious speed keeping him ahead of the legion of small explosions that herded him towards the Biju's slumbering form. When they tried to surround him, trapping him neatly in a swirling vortex of the buzzing, foe creatures, he flashed to his only high-ration marker on the Sanbai's back. That was a mistake. Deidara had clearly used the redhead's concern over his troops to strategize, realizing that, if cornered, there was only one place Naruto could go. The Deidara that was already lying in wait atop the beast sprang immediately, wrapping Naruto in a bear hug even as his skin began to pale and his form lost consistency. The gloopy clone swiftly locked down Naruto's mobility, congealing until the redhead was completely captive in the clay. It was only then that Deidara revealed himself, hopping down off one of his birds to land in front of the redhead. His hair was singed badly and it looked like one of his arms was broken, but he was still grinning madly. I knew it, not so tough after all. Although, to survive the magnificence of my C3 was impressive, I'll give you that, yeah. His hand was perpetually held in a half-ram seal, a warning that if Naruto tried anything he'd detonate the clay. But look at you, a Hokage at the mercy of my art. This is how things should be. Soon all of the world's leaders will understand that true art is an explosion. He gestured grandly, sweeping his arms wide, crying, "Katsu!" Only to falter slightly when nothing happened. His eyes grew panicked when Naruto began chuckling. You forgot something about leaders. He strained a moment and managed to break apart the now brittle clay, dusting himself off as he stood back up to full height. They're rarely ever alone. Deidara tried to flee only to find his feet rooted firmly in place, literally. When he looked down he saw tree roots growing up from the cracks in the sandbai's shell, securing to the spot. He scowled, free hand reaching into his pack of clay and molding a bird with astonishing speed. However, the moment he let the little thing loose, a senbon skewered it right out of the air, still crackling with Raiden chakra. A moment later and two swords were crossed against his throat, slowly forcing him down into a kneeling position. He could only glance at the four Umbu that had suddenly appeared with disbelief. But that's... When he strained his eyes over to where one of the operatives had been standing, they were still there. A moment later though and the henge dispelled, revealing a clone of a certain redhead waving at him congenially. Naruto could have had his clones perform the sealing from the start, but they were so much more fragile than Umbu and even one being dispelled by accident could have screwed up the entire process. Once the matrix was set though, the Umbu were more useful in other ways, as he was demonstrating. He strode forward, cutting an impressive figure in his new haori, face set into the epitome of the cold leader. When he came to a stop in front of the Iwanuknin, the man was trembling with poorly suppressed rage. Your art is derivative and uninspired. Deidara had only a fraction of a second to look offended before Naruto slugged him, instantly knocking him unconscious. There was a moment of silence before Komaka sighed. Hokage-sama, that was just awful. Chapter 43, Official Rounds. After what felt like hours atop the constantly shifting waters, although it was probably closer to about 15 minutes, the small pebbly beach was more than welcome. Naruto didn't even attempt decorum as he flopped down happily on the loose stones. He stared up at the sky for a moment, taking in a long, and in his opinion, well-earned, breath, before bouncing back to his feet. He was by no means revitalist, he still ached from dodging so many explosions at close range, but he felt a little refreshed. Well, that was eventful, he mused aloud as Mei, far more demurely, walked up to him. Both had sent their respective Umbu to help out in the fishing village. A few shinobi could make a startling difference in repairing buildings and helping with injuries, especially when one had Mokyuton. Tenzo would be grouchy, but he could do the work of weeks in less than an hour. The village would probably be in a better condition than before the attack by the time they left. Quite, Mei said. I understand you even managed to take yours captive. Naruto waved his hand noncommittally. I'll find out if it was the right call when we get back to the village. It'll be nice to finally put a pin in the Akatsuki though. Mei chuckled as the two leaders watched the ongoing reconstruction from a distance. Village folk tended to be slightly intimidated by such well-known and infamous shinobi. That I can understand most vehemently. Sasori wasn't amenable to capture then. Mei shrugged, although her eyes reflected something more vindictive. I wasn't in the most merciful mood, and Akatsuki has somewhat of a reputation in our country. Besides, I doubt we could get anything useful from whatever that man had turned himself into. Better just to be rid of him. Her glance turned sideways as she gave the redhead a thoughtful expression. Perhaps the terms of our negotiation could be altered somewhat. An exchange of information perhaps. In the interest of international security. A smirk pulled at Naruto's lips as he watched a house slowly grow from the ground like some well-organized plant. It would certainly be useful not have to constantly reinvent the wheel, I'm sure we can work something out. His features immediately darkened as he shifted the large scroll he was carrying under one arm. And on the note of renegotiation, there's the small matter of the sanbai to address. Mei almost visibly tensed and her words dropped the honeyed tint that was so integral to her seductive nature. Tread lightly, Hokage Dano. Naruto turned to her and she was surprised to find no hint of the stoic, sometimes amused Hokage that she had talked with in her office. Instead she found a tired young man. However, with the pretense stripped away, his warm violet eyes were replaced by something much harder and colder. I'm going to drop the charade with you, Mei. I want to walk away from here with the Sanbai. To her credit, Mei took this on with all the poise she had accumulated over her storied career. That's a tall order, Naruto. And I feel I should remind you that we are currently within my borders and I'm less than amiable to threats today. Some hint of the playful Naruto returned with the weary smile that tugged at his lips. I'm not threatening, Mei, I'm actually willing to make it quite profitable to you. A Jinchuriki is worth no amount of money, they're a somewhat limited commodity if you hadn't noticed. That managed to pull a dry chuckle from the man. Yes. You could say I'm pretty familiar with the idea. Mei had the decency to look abashed. Naruto's status was hardly a secret to the upper echelons of the Hidden Village's various organizations. It was just not thought about too often as the boy, well, she had to amend that to man after the events of the day, never used the power of the beast sealed within him. It was so easy to see him as the return of the yellow flash, and forget the far more dangerous detail of his heritage. My point stands. I wasn't offering money. How much does your village really need a Jinchuriki, Mei? He set the large scroll down, keeping a hand on one end. Especially this one, after your recent difficulties. He couldn't decipher her expression, so pressed on. What you need is aid. Not in the charitable sense, I wouldn't presume that much on you. But favorable trade agreements? Cooperation? Exchange of information? That's all in my power. He was throwing away his negotiating stance and she knew it, but as she had said, the Biju were one-time deals. Konoha could recover from a few unfavorable deals. Despite their own recent troubles, the village was at its most profitable in decades. The question was just how much Kiri had suffered during its civil war. Even from the relatively little he had seen of the village proper, Naruto was confident of the answer. That's a lot of political capital to throw away so early into your office, Mei warned, in the tone of somebody who hadn't decided and was simply stretching the conversation for time. I've been told I'm quite charismatic, I'd hope I could weather this. You're really serious about the cooperation between our village then? Something tells me this isn't some sham front designed to simply keep each other away from the other's throats. The redhead let out a deep breath, feeling that the conversation had crested some metaphorical hill. Where it went from here was determined by pure momentum. My father believed that the entire world could experience peace someday, a layover from his own teacher. Upon catching Mei's bemused expression he gave a wry grin. I like to think myself a bit more pragmatic, but it's still a nice future to imagine. So here I am, finally in a position to start, just maybe, forging events in that direction. Why not take it? He felt the next few seconds were crucial in a way that he would never truly understand, before Mei rolled her eyes. You know, against my better judgment, I find myself believing you. He was strangely glad to see that sultry smile return as she leaned in closer. You do realize this won't stop me from clawing every concession you could imagine from these future negotiations, right? I don't doubt it, Naruto said, chuckling. So, considering your intensity on the matter, I assume you have a Jinchuriki in mind for when you get back home. She was somewhat surprised by how quickly Naruto's face lost its mirth. If I have my way, the Sanbai will stay exactly where it is, in this scroll. Forever if need be. There was another long pause where Mei seemed to size him up as if for the first time, before her usual expression returned. You are truly the strangest man I have ever met, Naruto Namikaze. The redhead grinned. I try. He glanced back towards the reconstruction, noting it was significantly further ahead than before. There was something to be said for witnessing Kiri and Konoha shinobi working side by side to help people. So, allies then. Mei put a hand to her chest in faux astonishment as the two began walking towards the village. Now Hokage-sama. When did I ever say anything about an alliance? Naruto's smile didn't waver an inch, falling right back into the persona, this time with genuine enthusiasm. I believed somewhere between me agreeing to take on a Biju for you, and our little heartfelt chat just now. Why, I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about. Of course, of course. Naruto walked out of the council chamber unable to hide his disgust. The large scroll containing the sanbai was still slung over his lower back, but just barely. Many of the clan leaders, bar a few that had mostly just stayed quiet through the proceedings, were outraged by his refusal to create a new Jinchuriki. They considered it an enormous waste of an asset, considering the likely tremendous bargaining position Mei would have in the upcoming talks to properly smooth out their new relationship. It was a blessing that only a few people in the village had both the expertise and the position within the village's hierarchy to even attempt a sealing, namely, himself, Jiraiya and Danzo. It was the only positive of the exchange that the assembled clan leaders hadn't been delusional enough to believe handing Danzo of all people a Jinchuriki would be a good idea. The man might have been good at concealing his darker nature in the open, but there was still an air about him that didn't lend itself to trust. Ultimately, when it came down to his motivations for refusing the village such an asset, he had simply asked a single question. Are any of you offering your own children? Even Hayashi Hyuga wasn't cold or detached enough to say anything to that. Although mercifully he had been one of the quieter in the room, the man had always had a secret soft spot for family, even if the way he acted told a different story. If he was honest with himself, if any of them had actually said yes, Naruto wasn't sure if he could have stopped himself killing them on the spot. His child hadn't even been born yet and he couldn't imagine giving them over to such a burden. He didn't know what that said about his father, and he'd rather not think about it. And speaking of his child. So, what? I'm finding out you're back in the village from the Bluster twins now. He couldn't stop the weary smile spreading his whiskered cheeks. Seeing Anko, even if she was glaring at him, after all the craziness he'd gone through was refreshing. Urgent business. Why were you with Izumo and Kotetsu? For the dynamic dolts they get surprisingly good gossip, she admitted, and it's not like I have much else to do now that I'm officially on medical leave. Don't change the subject though, what's so important you can't even stop in to say you're home? Naruto adjusted the scroll on his back. The kind of business that doesn't wait. Anko's eyes turned into saucers as she walked over, or maybe waddled was more appropriate, her belly was starting to become more prominent, and prodded the scroll. Whoa, so it's true you really have a Biju in there. Okay, there's no way Izumo or Kotetsu knew that. How could you possibly? He trailed off when he saw Anko's impish grin, you were just speculating and I good as confirmed it for you. He gave a suffering sigh and ran a hand through his hair. One day I won't fall for that stupid trick. The violet grin only brightened. Not with me you won't. But seriously, a Biju in a scroll. Isn't that kind of delicate? I had a while to come up with this seal. It's a variation on two different containment seals cross-linked to provide simultaneous negative reinforcement so if one begins to degrade, and I'm basically talking gibberish to you, aren't I? Anko waved her hand back and forth for a moment before smiling sheepishly. It's a really strong seal. The redhead rolled his eyes. I'd like to think it's a bit more nuanced than that. But yes, it's a very strong seal. And carrying it around on your back. At that, Naruto just grinned. Can you think of anywhere safer? When she gave him a level stare he chuckled, dropping the overconfident charade. Plus, I basically engraved a hydration marker on the thing, I'll always know where it is. You gonna start a collection or something? Naruto put a hand to his chin, rubbing an invisible goatee in an eerie impression of Hiruzen. Everyone needs a hobby, but I think that might rankle some feathers in the other villages. This was likely a one-time thing. Anko eyed the thing again before shrugging. Ultimately, she put a lot of faith in Naruto and he had never led her wrong before. If he thought it was safe, she was okay with that. Whatever. It wasn't the normal reaction to having a partner walk around with what amounted to a very powerful bomb on his back, and in the wrong hands it was precisely that, but they were far from normal partners. She backed that point up by pulling him down for a searing kiss. Did I mention you're out of the doghouse? She added with a lidded gaze, only to abort halfway through as she winced, putting a hand to her stomach. Maybe, I might have to get you back for putting a kicker in me. She rubbed her belly in slow circles, as Shizune had instructed her. Oh yeah, our girl's a mover. Our girl? Naruto asked bemusedly. Anko shrugged. I got a hunch, call it maternal intuition. Naruto deigned not to comment on that. Speaking of, where's Haya? Playing with your kitties. Naruto winced dramatically and both glanced upward momentarily to pray for his team's sanity. When Haya played, nobody was safe. It made for wonderful training though. And on that note, as you've so helpfully reminded me, there are some people in the village I need to let know I'm back. Anko rolled her eyes in good humor. As long as I'm the one you're saying good night to. Naruto's answer was a quick peck on the lips. Good boy. Oh, and I thought I should let you know that Jiraya's in the village, wanted to meet when you had a moment. Naruto clicked his tongue, the Toad-Sunin still wasn't exactly in his good books. Sure, I'll get around to him eventually, his face brightened, but there are a few people a little higher on my list. Alright, see you in a dash, but Naruto had already vanished, leaving her to huff irritably. Show off. He took a great deal of satisfaction in seeing his students try to catch their breath, each in their own way. Ami was unabashedly sprawled out on the ground, airing her chest by pulling at her neckline. Sakura was watching her disapprovingly, too out of breath to properly reproach her as she leant against one of the training posts. Sasuke was standing, although there was a slight hunch to his back, as if he was resisting the temptation to rest on his knees. Their glaring silence was their own way of informing their teacher his surprise checkup was not appreciated. It's nice to see you're all coming along so well, especially with the techniques I suggested. I'm going to start arranging some solo missions for you guys as a team, really get you that on-the-ground experience. He chuckled when they couldn't decide whether to still be angry at him, or excited at the prospect. What brought this about, sensei? Ami asked, trying and failing to cover up her heavy breathing. It's been heavily suggested that providing too much of a safety net for you guys might stifle your growth. I think that's a crock to be honest, but with my recent responsibilities. He absently touched the scroll on his hip, and your guys' undeniable growth. He fought down the instinctive cheeky remark at seeing their grins at the praise, even I have to admit that having you guys out there on your own can only hone your abilities. That's Naruto talk for, I'm getting really busy, but you guys are like, super strong now so maybe you don't need me so much. I think, Haya translated happily from on top of his shoulders. Thanks Speedster, but we've gotten a pretty good grip on Naruto talk ourselves by now, we know what he meant, Ami said, winking at the silver-haired girl. Yes well, unraveling the innate mystery that is me aside, keep at it, I'm proud of you guys, I have other places to be, yada yada yada, Naruto drawled, turning on a heel to go. Of course, Hokage-sama. Ami couldn't resist calling to his back. Keep up with that lip, and I really will demote you, he shot back over his shoulder. So you keep saying, she replied without hesitation, only getting an airy wave as the redhead vanished into the trees. She only waited a few seconds before glancing to her teammates. Who's up for following him then? Why? Sasuke muttered, finally getting enough wind back to straighten up. I have better things to do than trail sensei around until he gets bored enough to teleport somewhere else. It's an exercise in futility. Didn't stop us when we were younger, Sakura offered with a shrug. Yeah duck butt, where's your sense of adventure? Probably somewhere back in those trees, along with half a pint of my sweat, and don't call me that. 1. You. 2. Come on, you know you're intrigued by that big-ass scroll. Of course I am. I'm just pointing out the futility of trying to follow Naruto-sensei anywhere. He's got a point, Sakura threw in, but I have to admit that I am curious. I know, right? Ami whined, flopping back down on the grass. What do you guys think's in there? Sakura and Sasuke shared a look, the obvious question going unsaid. I couldn't see anything with my Sharingan, he proffered reluctantly. Bloodline users were always remiss to reveal any flaws in their vaunted techniques. Oh, so it's super secret then? Or simply so heavily inscribed with seals that the sheer interference negates my vision, it is Naruto-sensei. Well, Sakura mused, it's a big scroll. Can't be too many things that it could be. Summoning contract. Ami hazarded, only to have Sasuke shake his head. He's shown no indication of having one before. Why start wearing it now? Besides, summoning contracts are usually held by the summons themselves, unless the summoner requests it. He looked up from his musing to see his teammates staring at him blankly. I may have looked into any contracts the clan may have had before. Well, anyway, you really think Sensei of all people wouldn't boast if he managed to get his hands on a contract? They are quite rare. What do you think he'd get? I'd bet it'd be something really ironic, like turtles or something. Not really pertinent to the conversation. Besides, Guy has the turtle summoning contract. Again, Sasuke looked up to find the other two just staring at him, although this time Sakura broke the tension. Seriously? Why doesn't that come up more often? And how do you even know that? Sasuke shuddered, a feeling that seemed to creep out of the very depths of his soul. His clone, and I refuse to believe that creature is anything but, has some sort of fixation with me. At that Sakura shared his shiver. You're not alone on that front. A mutual sort of understanding seemed to pass between the two before Ami coughed to break it up. So, what then? Something sealed. Probably the most likely answer, Sasuke admitted slowly. He was the type to loathe being proved wrong later. What could be so important that it would need Sensei's constant supervision? A Biju. It was her turn to get double-teamed in the stair department. Don't be silly, Ami. That's the stupidest thing I've heard all day, Dobe. Seriously, that would mean Naruto-sensei was walking around with a bomb on his back, all through practice. Even Tomato Head isn't that reckless. Besides, that's a horrid accusation to make. It would mean he was risking war with another village right after we got out of one. Don't be an idiot. Okay. Okay. Ami yelled in defeat, smiling despite the grilling. She knew her teammates weren't being serious. Geez, I was mostly joking anyway. So, what then? Some kind of serious criminal that's so dangerous Sensei needs to be their constant warden. Sasuke and Sakura shared another look before shrugging, answering simultaneously. Probably. Want to break into his house again to find out what it is. The Uchiha rolled his eyes. Because that went so well last time. It had taken him ages to get his eyebrows even again after that stunt. Oh come on, we're way better than we were back then. Sakura just snorted. Back when we were basically allowed to have free reign of the house because it was just for a prank. This goes a little beyond that. And why don't you just ask that psycho anyway? Isn't she your mentor or something? Don't call Anko a psycho, she's just quirky, Ami said defensively only to sag slightly. I'm going to, but if it really is some kind of village secret she won't, she's actually pretty strict about that sort of stuff. No kidding, Sakura mused, disbelief evident on her face. Which brings up the old point that you still refuse to tell us what got you so flustered the last time we did that. Ami felt her cheeks grow rosy at the memory. It was nothing, just a misunderstanding. She quickly jumped to her feet, suddenly intent on changing the topic. So, who's up for ramen? Sasuke and Sakura shared another one of their looks. Honestly, if they didn't just get on with it and make out Ami was going to hurl, and oh look, there was Anko's insidious influence on her poor, innocent mind, before the former shrugged. As long as it's not that cardboard from Chihiro's. No way, Ami practically breathed in relief, recovering admirably. I'm never taking Kiba's food recommendations again. That guy wouldn't know good food if Chuji was stealing it from him. It's Ichiraku's or nothing for this girl. Fine. Despite his students' beliefs, Naruto didn't simply vanish the moment he was out of sight. He normally would have. If you can teleport, why wouldn't you? If not for Ami. She much preferred when he carried her around at high speeds. Apparently travel by high ration was exhilarating, but over too quickly. She preferred her adrenaline highs to be a bit more drawn out. Honestly, Naruto wasn't sure if he should be indulging her in that regard, and probably wouldn't if it didn't seem so built into her DNA. But when it came to the silver-haired speedster, he was a soft touch, so ended up running across the village's rooftops at as close to a dead sprint as he felt was safe, for other people anyway. It wasn't as easy as it used to be. Haya was far from the little waif of a girl he had found over a year ago. Still, the way her cheeks turned red from the wind, and her excited screams as he took sharp turns at landscape-blurring speeds, drove him to keep doing it. Eventually, though, he had to deal with the inevitable pout when he wound down to a more human speed outside of the hot springs. He had to get around to Jiraiya eventually, and honestly, where else was he going to find the pervert? Nichan more. Your runs keep getting shorter and shorter. He hefted her off his shoulders and set her down, trying not to grin at the way she crossed her arms petulantly. Burden of the head, I'm afraid. I like to think I make up for it in quality. "S.A. stupid hat," she muttered, despite the fact that the day he had come home wearing it for the first time, she had run around the house all evening with it hilariously DW-erfing her head. "Maybe," Naruto agreed in the non-committal way that was universal adult language for, "You're wrong, but I'm not just going to say that. Besides, you're starting to get a bit big for our runs, and soon you won't even need me to go that fast." It wasn't far off from the truth. Haya was a demon at picking up the subtle techniques Naruto used to increase his speed, adding to her already impressive genetics. Naruto really wanted to meet an adult of her clan. They must be a sight to behold. No. He should have expected what came next, with Haya rocketing forward to clamp down like a limpet on his leg. Okay, maybe not that soon. He detached her easily by tickling her under the arms. Boy, had he been glad to lean that trick. "I'll always have time to run with you, even when you're too old for my shoulders." She just buried her face into his chest, mumbling something that sounded like never into his shirt, making him chuckle. "Okay, then when I'm too old for you to ride on my shoulders." That earned him an inquisitive look from under a veil of silvery strands. "I can't imagine you like Gigi." She squinted hard, like she was mentally trying to force the wrinkles onto his face. "Don't try too hard, I like the way I look," he shot back good-naturedly, ruffling her hair as he walked further into the complex. "Now come on, I brought you here for something fun. Remember Jiraiya?" "Froggy pervert," Haya confirmed with the kind of single-minded nod only kids could manage. "That's him, he's around here somewhere, probably invisible, I want you to find him." When he got another nod, he grinned. "Remember what Anko taught you to do when you find a pervert." She looked adorable when she scrunched up her face in thought like that, but eventually she nodded again. "Good, go get him." She was off like a little silver streak, and he didn't have to wait long for the shriek of surprise, followed by the inevitable splash. Only after the accompanying sounds of vague feminine fury died off did Haya return, looking like the cat that had caught all the canaries. Time like these remind him that Anko was going to make one hell of a mother. It took a few minutes longer for Jiraiya to drag himself over, but at least by the time he did, he had cleaned himself up slightly and wasn't looking any worse for wear. "What in the hells are you teaching that girl?" he groused, rubbing what looked to be a faint red footprint on one of his cheeks. "I didn't build the weapon, I just aim it." Jiraiya's lip twitched. "You're sounding more and more like the old man with each passing day. How's the hat? Starting to feel like a noose yet?" "You know, some people actually don't run from all responsibility like it's an angry ex. You should know, you practically helped raise one." Jiraiya waved him off. "Yeah, Minato always did have a bit of a martyr complex, nice to see it's genetic. Maybe you'd know more about it if you didn't spend your days crouched in front of a peephole, spying on girls a third your age." The self-proclaimed pervert grinned broadly. "Well, I'd go for half my age, but the MILF scene is a bit more niche." He gave the redhead a suggestive eyebrow wiggle. "I hear you're trying to break into that genre yourself." Naruto sighed, running a hand slowly through his hair. "If that's your own weird way of congratulating me for my kid, thanks. Otherwise, well, actually I don't really have to threaten you. Anko usually has that base covered." Jiraiya only shivered momentarily. "Where is the mother to be, anyway?" "From what I've heard, probably off getting chummy with your old teammate. They seem to have grown disturbingly close as of late." This time the fear was more pronounced as Jiraiya nodded sagely. "That is disturbing news. Although the certainly amusing story of how the hell you managed to get Tsunade back here aside, I did actually want to talk to you for more than just a catch-up. I'm not signing the Toad contract. I don't get why you're so persistent about this." Jiraiya waved again. "No, not that. You've made your point more than clear, thanks. I actually wanted to let you know that I may have scrounged up a lead about this brat's clan. Haya stuck her tongue out at the older man before the weight of his words actually sunk in, the petulant look becoming wide-eyed in an instant. You found the clan? Maybe, can't say for sure. Like I said, it's a lead. When you told me to keep an ear to the ground, I kept getting in reports of a group of silver-haired people that would pass through towns long enough to buy up a bunch of food and supplies before moving on without a trace. There was nothing concrete for a long while, and definitely no pattern to their movements, bloody definition of nomads. Couple of days ago though I got a strange tidbit about a girl staying behind. Not for long though, a week later she was gone. Not much of a lead, Naruto pointed out, a little disappointed. He wanted Haya to find her family, even as attached as he grown to her. Ah, but here's the kicker, she didn't go alone. Apparently, she ran off with one of the village's young bachelors, proper love at first sight kind of stuff. It really got the old creative juices flowing. Naruto grimaced at the image. I bet it did. But if they're gone, how does that help? Jiraiya rolled his eyes. Kid, these guys are a nightmare to track because they're so fast, right? Understanding quickly dawned on the redhead. But the civilian isn't, he'll leave a more prominent trail. He grunted irritably. But not for long. Damn, it's always just when I get back. He was surprised by the sobering expression on Jiraiya's face as he patted the younger shinobi on the back. If there's a trail, and I'm warning it may just be an if, then it won't go cold that quickly. Certainly not fast enough to warrant missing a night with your family, you'll want to take my word on that. The sincerity in the Sunin's voice was unusual. You're right, thanks for the information. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I guess I owe you one. He was much happier when Jiraiya immediately reverted back to a more typical, goofy expression. Ho ho. A favor from the new Hokage, now that will be one I'll most certainly remember to cash. Sure, whatever, just try not to get beaten to death by a mob of angry women before then. Or do, you should be old enough to lie in your own bed. Emphasis on should. Hasn't happened yet. Jiraiya exclaimed brightly, turning to return to his work. The redhead glanced down to find Haya pulling at the edge of her shirt, looking distracted, so quickly swept her up onto his shoulders. He was sure this was a lot to process for the girl. Come on, speedster, we better get home, we'll have a busy day tomorrow. Do you really think we'll find the clan? She asked, in an uncharacteristically subdued tone. I don't know, Haya, but I promised you I would try, and I don't intend to break that any time soon. He bobbed up and down suddenly to break her contemplative gaze and grinned broadly. Come on, I feel like taking the long way home tonight, we can even stop by that ice cream place if you want. For all the weight that had been piled on such a young girl's shoulders, she was still just a child and in many ways, predictable. The one that does sprinkles. You bet the one that does sprinkles. Chapter 44, Official Discoveries. Naruto woke with a start, a quick glance out the window telling him it couldn't be later than 3 in the morning. That was unusual. Naruto was, under the best circumstances, a light sleeper, out of sheer professional necessity if nothing else. What he wasn't, was prone to waking up without reason. There was a strange itching sensation in the back of his head that he couldn't pin down, his faculties still falling into place. Anko was on the other side of the bed, slumbering quite obliviously and practically wrapped around her pillow. She could probably sleep through an earthquake. The one he was wary of disturbing was Haya, who had cuddled up in between them. She hadn't done that for months, the news about her clan must have really rattled her. All in all, he couldn't spot anything amiss, and that was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. He carefully slipped out of bed, slipping on some pants and grabbing his haori off the back of the door as he passed. He could technically check the seals from anywhere in the house, but he didn't want to disturb his family if this was all nothing. Softly closing the door behind him, he paused. Seals. He couldn't feel the hydration marker on the Sanbai's scroll. Suppressing his panic with a wave of cold rationale, he immediately attempted to flash to it. Anyone watching wouldn't have even been able to see the moment he was gone before he reappeared, clutching his head. It felt as though he had rebounded off a less than proverbial wall. Wary against trying that again, not to mention rattled at the completely alien sensation, he instead focused intently on the seal instead. Usually his various markers were just a dull sensation that he could tune out during the day-to-day. They only intruded on his thoughts if they were recently activated or relatively close, like the ones he used in fights. If he focused though, he could mentally track every single kunai or seal he had ever placed, only growing more difficult the further they were away. This one was weird. It didn't feel far away, but at the same time it was muted. It was like trying to listen in on a conversation through thick layers of carpeting. You could tell somebody was speaking, but not make out the words. Now deeply unsettled, he slipped out a window and took to the rooftops, immediately regretting not putting on some sandals. He focused more intently on the marker than he ever had on a single seal before, feet moving where the pull in the back of his mind lead. By the time he came to a stop he thought something must be seriously wrong with him, as it was just a normal intersection, blank, empty streets all around. But the tug was still there, more pressing but still, off, and that only left one direction. He immediately sank into the ground, employing the very technique he had taught to his students on their first real mission. It worked perfectly, until he hit a layer of reinforced concrete he couldn't pass through. Naruto knew the village like the back of his hand, or he thought he did, and there was definitely not supposed to be an underground passage of any kind down here. Lacking the time to think about other options, a habit he was told would be the death of him one day, his hand lit up with the swirling energies of a Rasengan. Probably not the smartest thing to do surrounded by earth, but it made for one hell of an entrance as he blasted into the dim concrete tunnel below him. It was like a bucket of ice had been poured over his head. The marker he had been so intensely fixated on snapped into focus like a bowstring, and it was all Naruto could do not to instantly teleport to it. Instead, he took stock, taking in the barren, utilitarian passageway that stretched off in either direction with a steady curve that saw each end lost in the gloom. It was built in the familiar design of the Umbu compound, standardist for the various complexes they had scattered across the continent. However, this was no Umbu facility that Naruto had ever heard of. It was too deep underground for one thing. Where the hell was he? His mind turned furiously. He was in a complex below the village that he, the Hokage, did not know about. It was modeled on Konoha Umbu structures, likely meaning to as built by somebody with an understanding of their practices. That same person, or organization, had the capabilities to break into his house, steal an object he was keeping personal tabs on and, most worryingly, block the hydration. Theoretically he knew it was possible, but it required a complex understanding of the technique he didn't think anybody else had. For one thing, while the notes on the original hydration, created by the Daime, weren't technically a secret, the version his father had created most certainly was. But then, on second thought, the hypothetical thief technically wouldn't need those notes. The original technique still worked as functional teleportation, but it was clunky, took hand seals and much more concentration. His father had simply made it usable in combat. Well, there was nothing simple about it, but he hadn't changed the fundamentals of the jutsu. If somebody could figure out a way to block the Daime's technique, or perhaps just any space-time jutsu, then it would work on his too. That was definitely something to think about in the future. For now though, his thoughts led him in a very specific direction. There was only one figure he could imagine with the resources, knowledge, motivation and, perhaps most importantly, the sheer gall to pull something like this. Danzo. The low growl of his voice echoed slightly in the confined passage. He glanced down each end of the passageway again. Nobody had come to investigate the noise. He could still feel the gentle pull of the scroll's tag, and he was rapidly debating whether or not to just flash there. It was usually the height of recklessness to barge into a situation he didn't fully understand. On the other hand, when somebody steals a biju, they will damn well have a reason to. Chances are, it wasn't anything good. He could spend precious minutes searching this complex, getting held up by who knew what obstacles. Or, he could not. The scene he appeared within was essentially his worst-case scenario. It was a large, vaulted room, bathed in a sickly orange light. The scroll was to one side, linked to a much larger ceiling matrix that, in turn, encompassed the form of what appeared to be a child. He couldn't make out much else due to the dark, figure-hiding clothes and the blank white mask that covered their face. He could practically feel their pain though as they writhed within their bindings, back arching as far as the leather straps would allow. Strangely, they didn't make so much as a whimper, despite the burning orange chakra suffusing their body. Naruto had only pulled on that virulent well of energy in his darkest moments, and he knew the agonizing burn of it all too well. He was unsure of what that meant, and wasn't given much time to mull it over as his presence was immediately noted. There were 4 other figures in the room, one overseeing the ceiling and 3 others stationed at strategic points around the room. They all wore the same bland uniform as the unfortunate victim, looking like some twisted, blank parodies of the Umbu in their featureless grey cloaks. 2 immediately rushed him, lacking the usual pause of surprise, however slight, that his entrances normally gave people. So, they were expecting him. He wasn't in the mood to indulge Danzo though, and disabled them in the time it took a civilian to blink. The first tried to grasp him with an outstretched hand, but even in the strange undulating light the ceiling ritual gave off he could see the slight blue tint to his skin. Not wanting to find out what that was about, he intercepted the blow at the elbow, feeling the joint shatter as he stepped into the man's guard, grabbed him by the mask and slammed him into the floor at speeds that would have broken a normal man's neck. His companion didn't even pause at the casual display of brutality, bringing his hands up to flash through the signs of a technique that Naruto recognized as having many of the same seals as many Yamanaka techniques. Knowing what to expect from that, he sidestepped the vague ripple in the air without breaking stride and caught the man directly in the solar plexus with a kick that threw him across the room. He paused a moment, staring at the last guard with subtle traces of irritation puling at his features. He couldn't see what the man was thinking due to the mask, but the redhead knew enough about body language to recognize the complete apathy his attacks hadn't even shaken. What was he fighting? Robots? The man reached for something in his cloak. In that moment he broke eye contact, and in the single instant it took to look down, he suddenly found a knee occupying the space just in front of his mask. He slumped against the far wall without making so much as a grunt of discomfort. None of them had. It was disconcerting how quiet they had all been. Once again though, pressed for time, he disregarded the strangeness and turned to the one overseeing the ritual itself, grabbing him by the cloak. He nearly flinched away in disgust when his form suddenly went limp, the telltale foam of a poison capsule dribbling out from under the mask. The man was probably dead before he hit the floor. Which left him with a very pressing concern. Damn it! He pushed the dead form of the unidentified operative out of the way and examined the ceiling structure as fast as he could. Damn it! What he saw was not good. The seal itself was damn shoddy work. It looked good at a glance, and would likely hold, but it was unstable. The sealer had attempted to tweak an existing design that would see the Biju's chakra trickle into the Jinchuriki's system at a steady rate. What they hadn't accounted for was the effect this would have on the vessel's coils. Unused chakra harmonized with the user's body and naturally vented out to prevent damage or strain to the pathways. Foreign chakra on the other hand continued to build up in the system until it became damaging, one of the reasons why medics had to be so damn precise with their healing palm technique. You couldn't just shunt chakra at a wound and hope it healed. What they needed to have done was find a way of converting the Biju's chakra into a less dangerous form, like desalinating seawater. That was difficult to do even if you were good at fuinjutsu. It relied on a whole bunch of messy variables, including the Jinchuriki candidate themselves. Naruto grimaced as he looked down at the poor soul strapped to the table. He wasn't just going to let them die, and trying to revert the procedure now was as good as a death sentence. Damn it! He hoped their silence was a sign of resilience and not because they had already gone hoarse from screaming, because this was going to be messy. He worked steadily, with the precision of a surgeon, as he carefully began rewriting sections of the ritual, basically working on the fly as painstaking calculations started building an enormous web of increasing complexity in his mind. He forced out concerns like the reasons for all of this, the life relying on his success, and the absurd circumstances of all of this. There was nothing but the room, the seal, and his brush. His face became almost clinical in the detached way he worked, connecting loose kanji that might have caused instability or backdoors in the creation of the pseudo-dimension that would be holding the mass of sentient energy. There was a moment of genius when he managed to repurpose the original seal on the scroll, transplanting half of the matrix onto the Jinchuriki's stomach, while using the other half to sort of strain the Biju. It drastically reduced the potency of the chakra during the transfer and took the intelligence of the creature itself out of the picture for the moment. It also might have very well saved the Jinchuriki's life. When the final few motes of flickering orange light faded, plunging the room into near darkness, the redhead had to take a moment just to lean against the table, breathing deeply. The only thing left of the ritual was the seal shiki that remained on the original scroll, which could be used to alter the rate at which chakra flowed into the vessel, and the seal itself on the girl's stomach. He wasn't sure when he had realized it was a girl. He knew his mind had taken it into account as a variable at some point, but it had been just another stream of numbers at the time. With a final grunt of effort, he turned his hand slightly, folding the expansive and complex seal down into its compressed form. To an untrained eye it would look something like a squiggly hexagon spiraling in on itself, surrounded on each diagonal corner by a triangle pointed inward. It was nothing he'd have been particularly proud of if he had actually taken time to design it, but it would work. She would live. In a way, it was the first time he had properly acknowledged to himself that he was in fact working with a human life, and the thought nearly made him sick. She was clearly unconscious by now, the ceiling having taken its toll, but the blank eyes of the porcelain mask still seemed to stare at him accusingly. He pulled it off after a moment only to freeze as spiky blonde hair fanned out in a messy corona around her face. His eyes only noted that in passing, drawn as they were to her cheeks. The cheeks that held 3 distinct whisker marks. Naruto did not get angry. It was a fact for people that knew him, he was by nature forgiving and amenable. He didn't take the world too seriously, in the sense that he could maintain a sense of humor in a bad situation. On an off day he may go a little hard on a sparring opponent, or make a few remarks on the wrong side of sarcasm. He wasn't like the Raikage, going around smashing desks at the slightest irritation, or the Chuchikage, who might berate you until your ears fell off, or even the Mizukage, who would threaten to kill you over the slightest provocation. Naruto was furious. There was a simmering tension within the Hokage's office as he stood in front of the window, staring at the pre-dawn sky with his hands clasped behind his back, face completely unreadable. Hiruzen's anger had once been described as a physical weight pressing down on everything in the room. With Naruto, it felt as though somebody kept cranking the heat up, bit by bit. Even Jiraiya looked visibly uncomfortable. He had no idea how much of this was Naruto, and how much was the fox playing on a rare lapse of emotion. He wasn't sure which answer he would prefer. When the redhead finally spoke his tone was flat, almost emotionless. If anything, it just made it all the more chilling. I'm going to kill him. It wasn't a suggestion, just a deeply unsettling observation. Naruto, you know you can't act rashly, Hiruzen said softly, disguising his own discomfort at the situation. I'm just as furious as you are. He immediately knew that was the wrong thing to say as Naruto turned slightly, enough to train a single eye on the older man. His eyes were flat, the Kage's mind elsewhere. It was more like he was staring at a point a few inches behind Hiruzen's head. I doubt that. He didn't raise his voice at all, there was barely an inflection to it. That was inappropriate, I apologize. I didn't mean to make light of the situation. He's trying to tell you not to do something you'll regret later, kid, Jiraiya chipped in, although even as he said it he seemed uncertain of his words. Who said I would regret it? People often said rage made people act irrationally, that it impaired their judgment. Naruto thought they couldn't be more wrong. In his anger, everything had crystallized into perfect clarity, as though time had slowed to a crawl. It dragged out seconds into minutes, giving him more than enough time to imagine, one by one, the many, many ways he could end Danzo Shimura's life. It had entered the realm of the purely academical by the time Hiruzen spoke up again. Like, how much of their spine does a human really need to survive? Regardless of the crime, or its undoubted deservedness, caution must be given. As it stands, there is no proof. Proof. Naruto didn't need to raise his voice beyond its current whisper to be heard. The syllable seemed to reverberate around the room. The man kidnapped my sister the day my parents sacrificed everything for this village. Kept her locked away, brainwashed her into one of his ghoulish toy soldiers and was about to make an unstable Jinchuriki out of her. He took a deep, and far from calming breath as he turned. This isn't about proof. As if on cue, the sun chose that moment to peek over the horizon, casting the office in shades of red. For an instant Jiraiya thought he saw Naruto's pupils turn slitted, but it could have been a trick of the light and his own paranoia playing up on him. I agree, it saddens and angers me to see just how far my old teammate has fallen, a sentiment I'm sure is perfectly understood in this company. Hiruzen glanced at both Jiraiya and Naruto, but the former was too fixated on his pupil's son to acknowledge the statement. But you must understand how it may appear. You found a secret base below the village, now populated by dead men conducting a sealing on a girl who should have died 15 years ago. Despite where the evidence would appear to point, it is nothing but conjecture. I am the Hokage. It came out almost desperately as the flame behind Naruto's eyes began to falter. It was the first hint of emotion in his voice since he had realized who was beneath that mask. And tyrants rarely sit in comfy chairs for long. I am sorry, Naruto, but when it comes to this matter, we must tread carefully. The fury returned in an instant, icing over his moment of weakness as though it never happened. So, what? He gets away with it? All of it? My sister's suffering? That abhorrent organization he built? The other children torn from their families. He knew the significance of those Aburame and Yamanaka techniques being used. When word started getting out, he wouldn't be the only one calling for blood. Before Hiruzen could answer, Komaka burst into the room. She had been one of the first people he had contacted when he left the underground complex, firstly to wake and collect Tsunade, Hiruzen, and Jiraiya, then to get Morumbu and scour the village for Danzo. Tsunade was at the hospital making sure Sakura was okay, or as okay as she could be after 15 years with Danzo Shimura. It was probably for the best that she was kept busy with that. From the look on her face she wouldn't have even waited this long to go hunting. I'm sorry, Hokage-sama, we've searched the entire village. There's no sign of Shimura-san. Naruto took in the information with a stony silence before nodding once. Rouse the Hyuga and the Inyazuka, tell them I want search parties out immediately. He will be found and captured. Komaka nodded succinctly and immediately went to carry out her orders, leaving the three men alone again. This time though Naruto wore a thin, icy smile as he turned back to the window, watching as his village was roused into action. Innocent men don't run. Fires could only burn for so long, and it took all of Naruto's composure to keep stoking the one within him until the door clicked shut behind him. It shattered like so much useless glass the moment he was alone with his sister again. He glanced up at her from where had slumped against the wall, still not quite sure he could believe it. Tsunade had declared her as healthy as could be, physically at least. Her mental situation would be evaluated, in depth, the moment she awoke, which, given the fact she had recently undergone a Jinchuriki ritual at twice the age they were recommended, was currently uncertain. He was almost afraid to approach her, scared that if he did it might all turn out to be a dream, or some sick illusion. Really though, he wasn't sure if deserved to. You were alive, all this time, and I didn't even know. I was supposed to be there for you, protect you, help you grow up. He gave a tremulous smile, blinking his eyes as they became watery. You would have helped me heal, and I would have raised you. We would have been our own little family. Tentatively, like she might melt under his touch, he ran a hand through her hair, spiky and blonde, so much like their father's. But that was stolen from us, you were stolen from me, from the life you were supposed to have. The rational part of his mind knew that there was nothing a 7-year-old could have done at the time, but that part of his mind wasn't behind the wheel. There was a deep, noxious feeling in his gut that this was all his fault. If he had just tried harder, hadn't given up so quickly. For most of his life the girl in front of him had been nothing more than a name on a memorial, the promise of a sister that never came through. What was she to him now? What was he to her? Hey! He had heard Anko enter, but hadn't bothered to look up. When she gently pressed in against his side, wrapping an arm around his shoulders, he leaned into the contact. She's back, he whispered, refusing to let his voice waver. I know, like a miracle, huh? He could tell Anko didn't know how to react to all of this any more than he did. But he was thankful at least for the support. Just having her next to him kept him shored up. What's going on, Nichan? Hea piped up, grabbing his other hand on reflex. He nearly choked at the name. I thought we were going on a trip today. He had completely forgotten about Hea's clan. That lead, it could be the difference of ever seeing her family again. But, his sister. He couldn't just leave her. He couldn't ever leave her again. He squeezed her hand lightly. Hey speedster, you. He very nearly choked on his words, but forced it down. You like Anko and me, right? The girl furrowed her brow. Any other day he would have found that adorable, now it was just heartbreaking. I love you and Ne-chan. She said it with such sincerity, he couldn't believe he was even asking her this. You like it here, in Konoha, right? She nodded gently, still confused. So, if you had to stay here for a while longer. She picked up the inference after a moment and nodded happily, the simple innocence clashing terribly with the atmosphere in the small hospital room. I would live here forever, you're my family. Naruto could only nod slowly, unable to trust his words. He was deeply grateful when Anko squeezed him gently, that little current of affection going a long way in propping up his resolve. Then that trip might have to wait a while? Okay. Haya nodded uncertainly, and to prevent her thinking about it too much he quickly swept her up into her arms. There's someone I want you to meet, okay? He hefted her until she had a good view at the sleeping girl. This is my little sister, Sukuru. Her previous disappointment vanished as she stared wide-eyed at the new Jinchuriki. She's so pretty. The redhead choked back a sob, hiding it behind a trembling smile. Yeah, she is. She's been gone, for a long time, and she's not well, so we need to be there for her, all right. Haya stopped her hand short of stroking Sukuru's whiskers. Me too. He hummed, she's going to need a little sister to teach her all sorts of things. When she wakes up she might not know some stuff, and it might take some patience, so I'll need you to be strong, okay? At that Haya just bobbed happily. She wasn't blind, even children could be sensitive to the mood of the room, she was just excited about the prospect of another older sister like Ami to play with. I can do that. Naruto could only hug her tighter, planting a kiss in her silvery hair. Thanks speedster, I can always count on you, can't I? Speaking of which, Anko cut on softly, I think we should give Naruto some time alone with his sister, okay? Haya looked upset by that, but one look at Anko had her nodding in resignation, quickly allowing herself to be led from the room. Anko herself paused in the doorway, turning and offering a small smile to her fiancé full of enough warmth to lift some of the ice constricting his chest. Remember, no matter what, this is a good thing. He gave what he hoped was a reassuring look back, but was almost certain it didn't reach his eyes. When she closed the door behind her he felt numb again, uncertain of everything. Uncertain of what would happen when she finally woke up. Uncertain of what he could do for her, or what she would need from him. Uncertain that he could even give it to her. He hadn't felt this lost since that horrific night so many years ago. Slowly, and without really realizing it, his hands began working through a long sequence of hand seals. There was something he had been saving for a very long time, for a very specific moment in his life. He never thought he would use it this soon, and yet he couldn't think of a time when he had needed it more. When his hands came to a stop, the chakra ready at the point of no return, he had to take a deep breath to steady his resolve. The room seemed to glow for a moment as ink swirled on his palm, forming intricate shapes that steadily wound down the length of his arm. When it was complete, he placed his hand against the seal on his stomach, and twisted. The inside of the seal hadn't improved at all since the one and only other time he had entered it. It had been in a fit of childish bravery, when he had felt the need to confront the beast that had torn his world apart so thoroughly. He had come out of that interaction with nothing but disappointment. The fox was an asshole, simple as that. When an angry little human had entered its prison, it had simply taken to mocking the teen, correctly assuming that silence was the best way to irritate him. It didn't seem to have changed its doctrine, only lifting its head slightly from behind the massive bars at the unexpected intrusion. The Cuba was just as staggeringly large as he remembered, which was intimidating in its own right, but he had grown up a lot from that brash moment. The seal itself kept the majority of its chakra, and therefore its noxious, unbearable presence, safely locked up. There was less to fear from the creature than an ordinary fox. The Cuba wasn't what he was here for though. Instead he focused on the seal shiki inscribed on his arm, gently modifying it with careful thoughts. He wasn't really here, this was all a mental interface representing more abstract concepts. A few tweaks to the shiki tricked the seal into assuming that certain conditions had been met, without actually triggering them. Specifically, the seal currently believed that an excess of the fox's chakra was uncontrollably leaking into his system, and the internal barrier separating the cubia's spiritual manifestation had been unlocked. He felt them appear before he saw them, feeling tears well up in his eyes as the achingly familiar presence of their chakra. He almost couldn't bear to turn, the idea that they might not really be there torturous. Slowly though, he did, trying for a small smile that ended up being a bit more tremulous than he would have preferred. It nearly broke down entirely when he finally caught sight of them. "Hi Mom." "Hi Dad." That's it for part 11. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.